Hey guys, welcome to DIY Crafts. In this video, I'm going to show you how to crochet a baby frock. It's easy to make and fast working too. This dress fits to a baby of 18 to 24 months. You can change the pattern accordingly. So let's get started. For this, I'm using 2 strands of 4-ply yarn and a crochet hook of size 4.5 mm. Begin with a slip knot and make chain 58. So just put a count on each and every chain you work on. Make chain 58. Now place the stitch marker at chain 15 and chain 44 along the chain. Now make a slip stitch and join the ends to form a round. Now let's start making row 1. For this, chain 3 and make a double stitch in the next stitch. Continue making these double stitches until you reach the first stitch marker. Now in that stitch, make 3 DCs into the stitch. That means we are making an increase, and this increase will create a small V-shape pattern for our baby dress. So once the increase is done, this shape gives the V shape. So remove the stitch marker now and continue to make double stitches in each of the next chains until you reach the next stitch marker. Now we have reached the next stitch that is marked, which one is the chain 44. So just like the previous one, make 3 DCs into that particular chain to make it an increase. So once the increase is done, remove the stitch marker and continue to make DCs in the next few chains left until you reach the starting point. Now finish the row 1 by making a slip stitch into the 3rd chain of the first stitch. See, that's the top of the first stitch. Make a slip stitch into it, and this completes our row 1. You can now see that V shape that is created using increases in chain 15 and chain 44. That is the front part of the frock and one is the behind of the frock. Now let's start working for row 2. For this, make chain 4. Now slip 1 stitch and insert the hook into the next stitch and make a double stitch. For the next stitch, make a chain 1 space and leave 1 stitch in the base and then make another stitch. Chain 1, skip 1 stitch and DC. Again chain 1, skip 1 stitch and a DC. Chain 1, skip 1 stitch and DC. Continue this pattern until you reach the starting point. Now close the row 2 by making a slip stitch onto the 3rd chain in the first stitch. So this completes the 2nd row. Don't forget a chain 1 gap throughout the row. So this creates a nice pattern for our baby frock. Now let's start making round 3. For this, begin with chain 4. Now make DC over the previous DC, and we are leaving a chain 1 space as it is. So chain 1 and DC over the previous DC. Chain 1 and make a DC over the previous DC. So just like this, continue to make chain 1 and DC over the previous DC throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Once all the DCs are done, now make the last chain 1 and now make a slip stitch into the third chain on the first stitch, and this completes the row 3. Now chain 4 and start the 4th row. Again the pattern will be the same. Chain 1 and DC over the previous DC. Again chain 1 and make a DC on the previous DC. So this pattern continues up to row 8. So make the same pattern from row 4 to row 8, and or up to the body length you wanted to make it for the frock. So after making 8 rows, this is how the baby frock looks like. Now complete the last row by making a slip stitch onto the 3rd stitch, and this completes the 8th row. Moving on to the 9th row, make chain 3 and work a DC in the chain 1 gap. Now make another DC over the previous DC. Now another DC into the chain 1 gap and the next DC on the previous DC. Continue this pattern of 1 DC in chain 1 gap and 1 DC over the previous DC throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Basically, this is the solid line just like the row 1. So after working in all the DCs, just make a slip stitch onto the top of the 3rd chain to complete the row 9. Now we have to change the color. Here I am attaching 1 strand of green color 4-ply yarn. I am not changing the hook, just the same hook size. Change the color as shown. Now I am going to create a small waistband pattern. For this, make chain 2, that's chain 1 and the second one. Include the tail end while you are working for the line. Now make 1 single stitch in each of the next stitches. That's the single stitch. Just make 1 single stitch in each of the next stitches, and this gives you a nice finishing look of the waistband. Continue to make this until you reach the starting point. Do not cut the red threads behind. We are going to grab the threads while working the next row. Here we have done making single stitches throughout the row. Now I am going to close this row 10 by making a slip stitch into the chain 2 gap. Now again change the color to red strands using the technique shown. Now continue making row 11. For this, make chain 3. You can trim this green color thread now. Now make DCs throughout the row. That's the first DC. Now making another one. Include the green color tail end while working this row. This technique helps us in reducing the number of ends that to be woven at the end of the project. So continue making DCs throughout the row until you reach the starting point. After making all DCs, make a slip stitch into the 3rd chain of the first stitch. This completes the 11th row. Now make chain 1 and trim the edges. Make a knot, and this completes the top portion of the frock. You can just have a look at it. This looks so bright and the texture is awesome. It looks unique. Now let's start making the flare part. For this, I'm inserting my hook into any one of the stitches. Take one strand of the same yarn, 4-ply yarn, and the hook of size 4 mm. So let's make row 12. For this, begin with chain 4. Skip one stitch, that's the first stitch, so skip that. And now make 3 DCs into that stitch. That's the first one, second, and the third. Now chain 3, chain 2 and chain 3. Now again make another 3 DCs into the same stitch. So in one stitch we have 3 DCs, chain 3 and another 3 DCs. So this gives the shape of a nice shell texture. Now again skip one stitch and make one increase. Here make 2 DCs into the same stitch. This we call it as an increase. Make one increase. There is no chain gap or anything, just a simple increase. Now skip another stitch and make 3 DCs into the next stitch. That's the third one, and make chain 3. Now make another 3 DC into the same stitch. That's 1, 2 and 3. So this one stitch consists of 3 DCs, chain 3 and 3 DCs. That means 3 DCs separated by chain 3. So continue this pattern, skip one stitch and make one increase. That is 2 DCs into the same stitch. Now skip another stitch and make the cluster. Here the cluster consists of 3 DCs, chain 3 and 3 DCs. That's the chain 3 and 3 DC into the same stitch. Second and the third one. So continue this pattern of 3 DCs cluster, skip one stitch and one increase throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So once you reach the starting point, make the DC into the first chain 4 stitch. So this chain 4 and the DC together constitutes as an increase. Now make a slip stitch into the third chain. This is how we are closing the row 12. Now let's start making row 13. For this, make chain 3 and make a cluster into the chain 3 gap of the previous cluster. Here the cluster I refer is the 3 DCs and a chain 3 followed by another 3 DCs into the same gap. So this is the first cluster in row 13. Now make 1 DC in the first stitch and 1 DC in the next stitch of the next 2 stitches. That is the increase in the previous row. So after making 2 DCs, now make another cluster in the chain 3 gap. That is 3 DCs, that's the first one, second, third, and then chain 3. Now make another 3 DCs into the same chain 3 gap. So that's the first one, second, and the third one. Continue this pattern of 2 DCs and 1 chain 3 cluster and complete this 13th row. Repeat the same pattern for row 14 and 15. So after making row 15, this is how the frock looks like. Now make the last DC and make a slip stitch onto the third chain in the first stitch. So this completes the 15th row. Now let's start make 16th row. For this, chain 3 and then make a cluster into the chain 3 space. Here the cluster remains the same. That's the third one. Now make chain 3. That's the chain 1, 2 and the third one. Now make another 3 DCs into the chain 3 space. Here is where the pattern changes a little bit to increase the flare of the frock. So for this, what we have to do is we are going to add one stitch in between the increases. So make one DC over the previous DC. Make another DC in between the stitches of the previous row, that is the second DC. And now make another DC onto the second DC in the previous row. So the flare increases a little bit because the 2 stitches in the previous row are now made 3 stitches in the next row. Now continue to make the cluster in the next chain 3 space. That is 3 DCs, chain 3 followed by another 3 DCs. Just watch it carefully. That's the second cluster. Now make another 3 DCs. That's the first DC, second DC in between the stitches, and the third DC over the previous DC. Watch it carefully. I am performing a 3 DC cluster, that is 3 DCs, chain 3 and another 3 DC into the same chain 3 space. So continue this pattern of 3 DC cluster in a chain 3 gap and 3 DCs throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Now we have reached the last stitches of 16th row. For this, make one DC on the previous DC as shown. Now make another DC in between the stitches. So this makes a total of 3 DCs including the first chain 3 stitch. So now make the slip stitch into the third chain to complete the 16th row. Now let's start making row 17. For this, chain 3 and make a 3 DC cluster in the chain 3 space. That's 1 DC, 2 and 3. Now make 3 chains and make another 3 DCs into the same chain 3 gap. That's the first cluster. And now make 3 DCs over the previous 3 DCs. That's the first one. Here is the second DC and then the third DC. Now make another DC cluster into the chain 3 space. After the second cluster is done, now continue to make 3 DCs over the previous 3 DCs. That's the second one and the third one. So continue this pattern of 3 DC cluster and 3 DCs, again a DC cluster and 3 DCs throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Repeat the same pattern for rows 18, 19 and 20. After making 20 rows, this is how the flare looks like. Now make a slip stitch onto the third chain. So this completes the row 20. For row 21, make chain 3 and make a 3 DC cluster in the chain 3 space. That's the first DC, this is the second one and the third one. Now make chain 3 and make another 3 DCs into the same gap. Now we are going to make DCs. So make the first DC in the next stitch, and now in the middle stitch make one increase, that is 2 DCs into the same stitch. Then make another DC in the last stitch. So we are going to increase the 3 stitches to 4 stitches in row 21. Then continue to make 3 DC cluster in the next chain 3 space. That's 3 DCs. Next make chain 3 and another 3 DCs in the same gap. Now make 1 DC in the first stitch. Then make an increase in the middle stitch. Now make another DC over the previous DC. Now make a 3D cluster in the next chain 3 space. Continue this pattern of 3 DC cluster, 1 DC, 1 increase and 1 DC. Again another 3 DC cluster in a chain 3 space throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Here is the flare increases a little bit as we are adding an extra DC to the previous row. After making the last 3 DC cluster, now let's make the DCs. Make 1 DC in the previous DC. Now in the next chain make an increase, that is 2 DCs, and now make a slip stitch into the third chain in the first stitch. So this completes our row 21. Now let's start making round number 22. For this chain 3 and make a 3 DC cluster in the next chain 3 space. That is 3 DCs, chain 3 and another 3 DC into the same chain 3 space. Now make 1 DC over the next 4 stitches. That's the first one, second, third and the fourth one. Now make another 3 DC cluster in the next chain 3 space. After that, make 1 DC over the next 4 stitches. Continue this pattern of 3 DC cluster and 4 DCs throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Repeat the same pattern for rows 23 and 24 as well. So now we are going to complete row 24. So make a slip stitch onto the third chain in the first stitch. Now let's start making row number 25. For this, chain 4 and make a 3 DC cluster in the first chain 3 space. So after making 3 DCs, now make chain 4. So this helps to increase the flare a little bit more. Now continue to make another 3 DCs. That's the first DC, second one, and the third one. Now make chain 1 before you start the next DCs. Make 4 DCs over the previous 4 DC. Second, third, and the fourth one. Now make another chain 1 before you start the 3 DC cluster. So basically, instead of adding another stitch, we are just adding a chain which increases the flare. So chain 4 and make the next 3 DCs. Again a chain 1 and then make 4 DCs in the next 4 stitches. After making 4 DCs, make 1 chain and then continue making another 3 DC cluster in a chain 3 space with a chain 4 space in the middle of 3 DCs. Continue this pattern of 3 DC cluster with a chain 4 space, followed by a chain 1, 4 DC, another chain 1, and then make another 3 DC cluster throughout the row until you reach the starting point. Now make a slip stitch into the third chain in the first stitch, and this completes your 24th row. This completes the flare part. Just trim the excess threads and make a knot. Now let's add a nice border to it. For this I am using the same hook and 2 strands of 4-ply green color yarn. Insert the hook and grab the yarn from the second DC stitch in the previous row. And let's start making row 25. Make chain 3 and make 2 DCs over the previous 2 DCs. Now make chain 1. Now make 8 DCs into the chain 4 gap that we have made in the previous row. That's the first DC, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and the 8th one. So after making 8 DCs, here is how that looks like. Now make chain 1, then make 4 DCs over the previous DCs in the next 4 stitches. So 1, 2, 3 and the 4th one. Now make another chain 1 and make 8 DCs in the next chain 4 space. After making 8 DCs, make a chain 1 and make 1 DC over the next 4 stitches. After making 4 DCs, make a chain 1 and continue making 8 DCs in the next 4 chain space. Continue this pattern of 8 DCs in chain 4 space, chain 1, 4 DCs, chain 1 and again 8 DCs in next chain 4 space throughout the row until you reach the starting point. So after making the last 8 DCs in chain 4 space, make a chain 1 and then make the last DC in the stitch. Now make a slip stitch onto the top of the stitch, and this completes the flare part border of our frock. So chain 1 and trim the excess thread, weave in the ends, and this completes the frock. You can see how beautifully it had turned out with a nice bright red color and a light green border with a good flare. And of course, not to forget a light green waistline. Now let's start making the straps of the frock. For this, identify the center stitch at the front and the back side of the frock. That is the chain 15 and the chain 44. Now from that stitch, count 7 stitches either ways and mark those stitches with a stitch marker. So after marking all the 4 stitches, now let's start making the straps part. Now take 2 strands of the green color thread and insert the hook and grab the yarn through one of the stitch marker, and then you can remove the marker. Now go ahead and start making chain up to the required length. After adding all the straps, this is how the frock looks like with all the 4 straps added. Now let's add some embellishments and highlights for our frock. For this, I'm taking few daisy flowers and Irish leaves to it, and then I'm going to add them to the frock with the help of a tapestry needle. Adjust and secure them with the help of a safety pins before you attach them. So this tip helps us to keep the flowers in place. So after attaching the appliques, here is the final outcome. Let's have a look at it. It has a nice long straps to fix it on the shoulders. Then comes the yoke and body part in the beautiful checks pattern with daisy flowers and leaves applique. Then comes a waistband partition from body to flare. Now we have a medium flare for the frock with a unique pattern which makes it feel soft and fluffy. And now we have a little border in green color which makes it stand unique. Hope you all like this video. If so, please hit the like button. Do try it and share your thoughts in the comments section below. Share it with your crochet buddies and explore the fun of crocheting in groups. Subscribe to my channel for more such videos. See you all in the next video. Thank you for watching. Please like the video, share it and subscribe to DIY Crafts.